Good morning. Well, it's Wednesday again. Wednesday a week ago, if you are like me, you were glued to the television set for much of the day, trying to understand what was going on in Washington, D.C., trying to make sense of it all. And if you're like me, you've spent the last week doing those same things. I have turned to the scriptures and they have helped. I have turned to prayer and it has helped. And then I remembered a Presbyterian minister who helped me get through my childhood, although I didn't know him as Reverend. I knew him as Mr. Rogers. And over his long career, he often had to help children and even their parents figure out how to get through difficult times. When President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. were assassinated, he felt like he needed to address those on his show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Later, when 9/11 happened or the Challenger explosion, all these tragedies that have happened in our lives, he was there for us. And he shared in an interview not too long, I think, before he passed away, about one of the things he shared and how important it was. And so let me share with you his own very words.
You know, my mother used to say a long time ago, whenever there would be any really catastrophe that was in the movies or on the air, she would say, always look for the helpers. There will always be helpers, you know, even just on the sidelines. That's why I think that if news programs could make a conscious effort of showing rescue teams, of showing medical people, anybody who is coming into a place where there's a tragedy, to be sure that they include that. Because if you look for the helpers, you'll know that there's hope.
Look for the helpers, and that is where we will find hope, he says. And that is very true given this last week. And I want to share a couple of stories of two helpers that have brought me hope in this last week. The first one is Eugene Goodman. Eugene Goodman is a Capitol Police officer charged with protecting the Capitol, and more importantly, charged with protecting those who work there in the Capitol. And he was one of the officers who, all by himself, was accosted by the mob. He found himself all alone and trying to prevent them from coming into the Capitol and then making a deeper incursion into the Capitol. And there was a photographer behind him recording all of what was going on. And as he and the photographer kept getting pushed back, they were making their way up staircases, and he would get to the top of a staircase and try to stop the crowd, but they would continue on. And at one point he gets to the top of a staircase and he looks off to the left, and he almost moves to the left, and then he turns and he starts backing down the hallway to the right. And what Eugene Goodman had done was, when he looked to the left, he realized the Senate chamber was right there. And the doors to the Senate chamber were open, and his first instinct was to move, to put his body between all of those protesters, all of that angry mob, and the senators who were inside. And then he realized that he would not be able to stop them. And so instead, he led the mob away from the Senate. And several senators have said that Eugene Goodman absolutely saved lives that day. And many in that mob were bent on assassinating the Vice President, the Speaker of the House, Senator McConnell, or others. And he led them away from the senators who were in the chamber. And we know that those doors were open, and it took a whole nother minute for the doors to be closed and locked, and then for the senators and the others in those chambers to be escorted out and be able to make it to safety. And so Eugene Goodman, using creativity and using wisdom and using tremendous courage, was a helper. Another helper that day was Chef Jose Andres, and you may be aware of him. He has the World Food Kitchen, and whenever there is a disaster somewhere, a tornado or a hurricane or an earthquake, he shows up with a group of cooks, and he uses local cooks in the area, and he buys local as much as he can so that he can help stimulate the economy, but also help feed people in a time of crisis. his headquarters are in Bethesda, Maryland, and when all was going on in Washington, and Washington declared there'd be a 6 p.m. curfew, Chef Andres realized some of those workers, the first responders, the Capitol Police, and others, they're not going to be able to eat because restaurants going to be closed down. And so he went and he collected 120 pizzas, and then he got his food truck, and somehow he got permission to come down to the Capitol in the food truck. He distributed the pizzas, and then he and some of his chefs worked tirelessly to fix meals for those who were serving there in the Capitol. Again, he was creative and he was swift and he did what needed to be done, and he brings me hope. Sunday in our worship service, we looked at the parable of the Good Samaritan. And in that parable, Jesus has 3 different characters, the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan. And at the end of the parable, Jesus asked, and which one was a neighbor to the injured man? Sounding like he is quoting Mr. Rogers. In fact, when Mr. Rogers asked all of us if we would be his neighbor and taught us that all people are to be our neighbors, he was just acting out of what he knew as a Christian, acting out of his calling as a minister. And when Jesus says, who was the neighbor? And the man replies, the Samaritan. Jesus says, go and do likewise. I don't think it's so important what we think about what happened in Washington or what we think about what might be happening in our own hometowns. What is important is how will we respond? And so I invite you to take a cue from Eugene Goodman and Jose Andres and make sure that you have a response that is rapid, that is courageous, that is creative, even a little fun, even in the spite of evil. We can still have some fun making dinner for people or whatever. And make sure that you do it, because surely that is the way that we prove to be a neighbor to others. And we can do these things, of course, because God is with us.